name's Evan Leibovitch. I'm president of the Internet Society Canada chapter, and I'm here with Stephanie Perrin. She's been a privacy expert for 30 years. She's been a member of the ICANN expert working group on Who Is, and she's involved in a PhD research project at U of T. Could you tell us a bit about your project?
Thanks. Actually, what I'm studying and looking at is why privacy-enhancing technologies don't get implemented. Basically, what are the factors, what are the issues that stand in the way of actually moving forward with bringing in technologies to protect identity. And I'm studying it in the context of ICANN, where privacy has been difficult to embed, I think it's safe to say, in the ICANN domain space. So I'm looking at many of the impediments to bringing these things in. Over the years I've studied this. When I was at ISOC Canada working on the privacy legislation that passed in Canada, PIPEDA, we basically said you need a toolkit approach to protect privacy. You need codes of practice, you need law, you need privacy-enhancing technologies, and you need public education. That was our toolkit. And after we got the law through Parliament, I went and worked at a company called Zero Knowledge Systems that was producing anonymity software back in the dot-com days. It was kind of cutting edge and ahead of the market, really. But it was something I believed in. And as we can see from events recently, it would have been good if everybody had bought the product back then. So that's what I'm interested in looking at, is what gets in the way of these things.
Well, one of the things we've been talking about previously has been about, there's been an obsession with people thinking about government access to data, about the dangers of the NSA, about all the things Edward Snowden has brought to bear, about government surveillance of private data. But you've been talking about something quite different, that there's other threats that people have to be concerned about private access to their cloud data that people aren't even aware of. Could you talk a little bit more about that threat?
Well, and that's part of this toolkit that I was talking about. People have no clue what happens to their data. They don't even know that they have a legal right now in Canada to access their personal information that's held by different organizations, but only a handful of people have ever done that. So they don't basically know where the data is. And that appears in press articles, but what it means in reality is a whole other thing. So, for instance, you don't really, when you click I agree and allow people to get your data online, you don't know the data map of that, where it goes. You also don't know that there's a lot of risk analysis that is based on what I would call privacy of groups that's being invaded. So if you buy a particular product, it puts you in a particular group. Smokers know that all smokers are going to be discriminated against if it comes to health insurance in the United States, for instance. In the United States, where the health insurance system is much more privatized, of course, people are more aware of that. They're aware of what shouldn't go on their health record. We're not aware of that in Canada. We're not aware of risk assessment. And basically, I think risk assessment is a good way of describing what's going on with this tiny little bits of data that builds a profile about you. In terms of scholarship, Oscar Gandy wrote a book way back in the 90s called Panoptic Sort, when data mining was fairly young and fresh, and he was looking at how people were being sorted according to their data patterns that were being vacuumed up. He came back to it a couple of years ago and wrote a book called Coming to Terms with Chance, and he had pretty well given up on privacy law as a useful way of protecting against this kind of mass surveillance that's going on based on small bits of data that you would consider not important, but when it's put together with all the other bits of data, it creates a very accurate risk profile for you, and that means discrimination in terms of services.
How has this been influenced, though, by sort of the Facebook generation, where people have come to believe that there's a trade-off in that they're going to get things for free, they're going to get social networking for free, or their YouTube videos for free, in return for giving up information about themselves? Do people really understand that trade-off going on?
No, they don't. They think, I think by and large, and there's been very little research, but there has been some lately, uh, into what people actually understand in terms of where their data goes. They think about who gets to see what they post, and they think about it in terms of their personal profile, who their friends are, how much of what they post shows up. They don't think about the patterns that are compiled about them and then sold to retailers, sold to corporations, sold to HR consulting services. I mean, if you really want to understand when people are going to wake up, it's when they figure out that this is going to affect their jobs. People always say, well, young people don't care about privacy like you older people. And I identify in that group, I can tell you. That's because young people characteristically take much more risk, you know? It's the same across health issues, driving fast, you know? All these factors, they don't necessarily calculate them the way somebody my age does. But then when they realize the impacts of some of these data profiles, that's when they get concerned. And of course, this is why this movement has started in Europe about the right to be forgotten. Right. Because this stuff is up there forever. And unless you go back and you look at your profile or you look at your records and ask for them, you don't see, oh my gosh, look what I said 10 years ago. That's a little embarrassing.
So what is going to cause for a sort of shift in attitudes that's going to raise this awareness? Does something catastrophic have to happen, some massive data breach or revelation, or is this something that's just going to happen organically with people caring, or is it possible that it'll go under the radar forever?
Well, the pattern is that we wait until we stack up so many accidents at a corner before we put in a stoplight, you know. And privacy advocates like me started talking about privacy Chernobyls back about the time that Chernobyl happened. We were looking for those big meltdowns. Sometimes they happen and nothing it comes as a result of it. So, for instance, there was a big scandal about cookies with the double-click thing back in 2000.
Right.
Well, we got through double-click and nothing happened. I mean, there's some programs to compile your cookies and not accept them or accept them, but there's an awful lot of services where if you don't enable cookies, you don't get the service. Most of us are too lazy to go back in and turn them off afterwards. So, did that one work as a meltdown that changed behavior? Not really. When it comes to breach disclosure, there was a big kerfuffle a few years ago. ChoicePoint got in the news over data breaches, and that caused a whole slew of data breach notification legislation in the United States that has crept across the border into Canada. And so data breach notification is happening. And this is a really slow way to get there, one accident at a time, you know. It's a slow way to get stoplights on all your corners. When you have this bigger, much broader phenomenon, we now can sort through all this data and come up with risk profiles. And that strikes to the very heart of the kind of society we want to run. We don't want different people getting different prices to buy their basic commodities based on whether they're a desirable customer, that they're wanted. Right. You know, we could wind up in the rather ironic situation where desirable customers, people with money, get better prices than the average Joe in the street who needs the price break. And so from a social policy, that's a real concern.
So taking this into policy, is this something that is fixable by regulatory technique? Is it something that has to be done through business? Do we have to see a growth in products such as DuckDuckGo, which in return for changing its business model says we don't collect your data? Do you see a growth in online products that are saying, well, we may charge you to use our email service, but in return we won't collect your data? Do you see realistically a shift happening to that kind of thing?
I would liken it to the environmental movement. You know, I have to say, way back in the 70s, I didn't think we'd ever really see the day when people were washing out their cat food tins and getting them collected and getting the things recycled. And it's taken that long. We used to wash them out and put them at the curb, but then they got thrown into the dump in many places. So I think, if I can use that analogy, you're going to be looking at the same sort of phenomenon with this massive data collection. only a few people will pay to go to the company that protects their data. Most people will continue to use the free service and say, well, you know, if I can't see it, how is it hurting me, you know?
But in the case, for instance, of blue bin programs like in Toronto, you have to pay for your non-recycled garbage depending on how much you throw out. Is it going to require some kind of specific government, either regulation or financial incentives, in order to make this change happen?
I think we're going to have to get there, because at the end of the day, it's when people actually pay, whether they're companies or individuals, that you start seeing significantly better behavior. So the data breach laws, for instance, if you're going to be subject to massive fines or liable to civil suits, that smartens people up in terms of putting in place the practices that they need to make sure that their laptops are encrypted or their USB keys are numbered and counted and that they've got some idea what's on them. So, and similarly, employee behavior. Until recently, there hasn't been repercussions for employee misbehavior in terms of the personal data of their clients or citizens. So that has started creeping into various legislation, codes of practice, and all the rest of it. There's one thing that I think can be done through public policy, and that is looking at the actual ethics of this. And we don't talk a lot about ethical practice, but ethicists do, obviously. They talk about whether it's the right thing to do. I don't think we talk enough about whether it's the right thing to do. And if the public aren't aware of where their data is going, then they can't even have that conversation. So as professionals in this area, I think we have a responsibility to get that ethical discussion going. Because most people have a good sense of right and wrong, as long as they know what's going on. Right. And if they don't know what's going on, then it can just slip under the radar for years.
So awareness is the first step.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, and then it will take, getting back to that toolkit, it's going to take a combination. Regulation is hard to tune for each one of these different examples, you know. Right. And I know when we were working on the legislation to cover the private sector, you have to kind of go high and broad, because what's suitable for a telecommunications company isn't necessarily suitable for a bank, and it isn't necessarily suitable for the dry cleaner on the corner, you know. All of those folks deal with customer data. There's different tracks that the customer uses in each of these different retail environments or consumer or commercial environments. So it's really hard to regulate something across the board, but you basically want the same ethical principles for all.
Right.
So.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Okay.